Thank you very much. It's just such a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted. This is a really interesting conference. It's really timely. This is a really exciting moment to be working on macro and climate change. Not only is it an urgent moment, but it's full of changes, and it's full of important intellectual opportunities. I'm especially heartened by the activities that central banks, such as the Central Bank of Chile, and those that are engaged in the NGFS enterprise are doing to make sure that central banks are aware and ready for the challenges of the energy transition and climate change. And in some cases, central banks are also using opportunities to be more of a climate agency as well as a central banking agency, depending upon their mandate. So let me just set the stage. I think this audience is a sophisticated one, and you surely know many of these things, but I'm just going to reiterate the dramatic paces of change that require economists, and especially macroeconomists, to be paying close attention. One of them is the impacts of climate change are worsening. We know that just from the world around us. Here's one quantified way to do it, which is to look at billion-dollar events. This happens to be billion-dollar weather disasters. This happens to be in the United States. And I guess I should say, coming from the United States, as sort of typical American, most of my examples are from the United States. So just cut me some slack. Peak fossil fuel demand and changing energy markets. I'm going to come back to this. This is really an interesting change, too. So, of course, it's not a physical consequence of climate change like the previous example, but it's something that's going on in transitioning energy markets. So EIA has forecasted that fossil fuel demand is going to peak around 2030. Those are tough forecasts to make. Who knows? But I think the interesting thing about that is the geopolitical risks that it raises. Not just, it's of course something that we need to have happen as we decarbonize, but it raises important geopolitical risks as we have declines of, as we will see declining petrostates, pressures that are put on. And I'm going to come back to that. And this is just an example. This is a graph of volatility of oil prices and natural gas prices, and I'm going to come back to this plot because it has some, I think, important lessons for us. And I think about the policy situation. You know, the world, I think, is now becoming increasingly aware that everyone in this room is aware that we need to be taking aggressive action to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. The world and politicians are getting there. This is an example. What I have showing here is effects of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is our large climate policy that was passed last year in the United States. And the upper set of projections are from an ensemble of models that integrate the Inflation Reduction Act into a macroeconomic and emissions models. And then the upper set is the counterfactual of what if we didn't have the Inflation Reduction Act, and the lower set is the projections with the Inflation Reduction Act. And you can see that the Inflation Reduction Act reduces emissions by about 10 percentage points in 2030 and 2035, which of course is a very substantial amount. On the other hand, it's only 10 percentage points. So a lot more climate policy has to happen in the United States, and a lot more climate policy has to happen around the world if we're really going to be on target for something like 2050 net zero goals. So there's a lot of climate policy uncertainty. Okay, so what does this paper do? And then this is, I think, one more comment, and I'll come back to this. This is looking at fiscal sides of the Inflation Reduction Act. The upper, I guess for this audience, the chart on the upper left there is the dramatic one, which is the current Congressional Budget Office outlook for the long-term debt to GDP ratio, and you can see that it's really quite a dramatic increase that's being projected. And on top of that, the Inflation Reduction Act and other subsidy-based climate policies are likely to only exacerbate the situation if that's the direction that we go. So a couple of ways to read this, but certainly fiscal policy is imposing some constraints on climate policy, at least in the direction that we've taken it in the U.S. Okay, so what does this paper do? So there's a great deal of new work and a great deal of old work in climate and macroeconomics, and what this paper attempts to do is review all of that, synthesize it, and then try to focus on areas that we have great opportunities for additional work in a pressing and timely way. So there's the urgency of climate change policy, but there's also the urgency of making sure that we understand how traditional monetary authorities and fiscal authorities can anticipate and respond to various risks and challenges associated with climate change and the energy transition. So there's a lot of different dimensions of the existing papers that are out there. Presenting a survey paper would be particularly dull, so I'm not going to present the survey paper piece of this. What I am going to do is I'm going to summarize some main features or some main takeaways. I will apologize to the central bank audience. This is kind of geared towards academic macroeconomists, but that's how we talk to each other, and that's how we make progress. So we're going to organize this. Around the Carney framework of physical risks and transition risks. One thing I would stress is that transition risks sometimes, at least in its initial inception, is framed in a fairly narrow concept having to do with climate policy and climate policy implementation. That, of course, is important, but I think we need to have a much more capacious interpretation of transition risks, where it really looks at implications for financial markets, implications of uncertainty, voluntary activities, geopolitical risks, and basically anything that the human system, political system, human behavior does in response to these very substantial changes that that we are beginning to undertake, but for which most of it is in the future. So our organizing principle is the physical risks, and then we break down transition risks into three different categories: mitigation risk, which is really associated with the macroeconomics of mitigation policy and the energy transition; adaptation risk, which is the macroeconomics of climate adaptation; and then implications for fiscal and monetary policy. So I'm not going to march through those in that order because that would be, as I said, rather dull. What I am going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the main conclusions, 6 main takeaways that we have, and then I'm going to try to illustrate that. So at the highest level, we have done a great deal of work, we collectively as macroeconomists, that has really advanced our knowledge of a lot of important areas, interactions of macroeconomics and carbon taxes and other sorts of policies. But there's an awful lot of areas that are nascent and I think we can expect to be increasingly important in the future, such as the macroeconomics of climate adaptation, or to put 2 words that maybe don't necessarily sit well together historically, the development of adaptation policy. I'm not sure that adaptation policy is a thing, but perhaps macroeconomists can help to make it a thing and can try to start to think about this coherently. So I'm going to march through our main conclusions and try to make this a little bit controversial. So we'll put some stuff on the table here. So one conclusion is, if you look at much of the historic literature dating back all the way to Nordhaus in the 1970s, much of the historic literature in macro and climate has focused on estimation of things like the social cost of carbon, which is the monetized net present value of a ton of damages from emission of carbon dioxide, to think about optimal carbon taxation and optimal carbon pricing. My view is that this is a super rich literature. We know a lot about it. There are certainly many things that could be developed further, but my recommendation, it's also been a source of a great deal of controversy, and I'm going to touch on that. My conclusion is that we just declare victory on this, and we can move on to other topics that are arguably much more pressing, that we have good sense of what these challenges are. And so there's a number of key tensions that have really pushed there's a number of key tensions that have actually pushed this debate. And I think one basic the discussion of the social cost of carbon, as I think many of you know, has been one that's been quite fraught. It's been fraught within the profession, but it's been especially fraught between the profession and, say, natural scientists and politicians. So underlying the social cost of carbon concept is this nature of equating marginal benefits to marginal costs. So we need to figure out what the marginal benefits of reducing emissions are, the marginal damages of emissions. We need to figure out those marginal damages, and then that's going to give us a framework for thinking about optimal policy in the context of a carbon tax. This has been a fraught concept for a couple of reasons. One is that if you just equate marginal benefits and marginal costs, assuming that marginal abatement curves continue to rise, we're going to be emitting in perpetuity, and so the planet is going to be warming in perpetuity under this framework. And that's one that doesn't sit well with a perspective of taking a precautionary motive where you might want to limit temperature rise to a certain amount, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and so forth. So there's a fundamental tension conceptually between approaching the social cost of carbon and its cost-benefit analysis framework, and then alternatively just imposing some sort of cap. This is underlying that is a big debate over the value of internal debate to the profession, the value of integrated assessment models. I think this has been it's been a lively debate. It's been an informative one. But as a practical matter, I think we, as I said, just can declare victory. And so what's my argument for that? The most recent round of evidence from the EPA in terms of the social cost of carbon clocks in at a number of around $190 per ton. That number is arguably smaller than the number in much of the literature now. There's the RFF, there's a Resources for the Future team that I was part of that worked on a new estimate, and that came in at $185 per ton. There's a meta-study by Fran Moore, a number of authors, Maurice Drupp, a number of others, which looks at literature only through 2020, not the most recent round of literature, and gets estimates, a median estimate of around $470 a ton. So these are really, really big numbers. There are well understood reasons why the EPA approach probably understates. The EPA approach focuses on a few specific climate damages: mortality, agriculture, labor productivity, sea level rise, and I'm missing one. So it focuses on five main categories. Energy, thank you, Marshall. And of course, it emits a huge number of categories. It emits values of species, conservation, biodiversity, ecosystem services. So many of the topics of this conference and the effects of climate on those are not in there. So there's every reason to think that the EPA number is a lower bound. Okay, so what's the point of this? The point of this is $190 is way above most of the estimates of effective climate policy to make really a very substantial chunk of emissions reductions. Now, maybe when we're down to a very, much reduced emissions levels in, say, 2040, if we're successful globally, then we might be looking at some higher cost estimates. But even I think that this number is probably in the realm for decarbonizing aviation, would be my guess based on some reasonable technology projections. So I think that more debate over this topic, more estimates of the social cost of carbon. I don't think that's the most valuable use of our resources. Despite we can say that's the agree to disagree approach here. So here's just a list of a number of different things that you could be putting in. So even the health component only includes mortality, and it doesn't include any morbidity, for example. Okay. I include rights of nature here because I want us as economists to be keeping in the back of our mind that there are lots of different views, not just the economists' views on these matters, and that we need to be cognizant of how those play into the overall sets of debates. Okay, I think. Okay, so this is and the context here is like the second conclusion, which is just we need to remember that GDP doesn't equal welfare. So you will sometimes find out there saying climate change just isn't a big deal. macroeconomists or the climate economists are forecasting that GDP might be 10% or even 20% lower in 2100 than it otherwise would be. But the thing is, we will have quadrupled GDP by then. So it's a really tiny amount, and it's something we shouldn't worry about. So there are a couple of things that one could unpack from that, but the main thing that I would unpack from that is that GDP isn't welfare. So that, yes, that might be true for GDP, but that doesn't mean it's true for welfare. So the easiest example of that, there are multiple examples of that. An easy example of that is just thinking of storms. So there is debate in the literature about exactly what the GDP effect of storms are, but certainly one set of estimates suggests that when hurricanes land, especially in developed economies, that when hurricanes hit, of course, that has a negative effect on output right away. So you'll see a decline in employment, decline in output, and so forth in the local region. But then you've got this rebuilding boom, and then because of the rebuilding boom, lots of people are back to work, and that goes into GDP. Those are investment figures and employment figures, so output goes up, and then it plateaus. And so maybe the net GDP effect of in the medium run of a hurricane is about zero. So that's a plausible. You can bicker with that, and some papers might say it's positive, some papers say it's negative. Depends on the circumstances, depend on the granularity. But the point is, that's not to say that hurricanes have no effect. Hurricanes have big effects on dislocation and welfare and physical capital and so forth, but they just might not have an effect in short-run GDP measurements. So that's just one of many, many examples. Another example is heat waves. Heat waves are the most vulnerable are the poor and the elderly. The poor and the elderly don't make much of a contribution to GDP, especially the elderly if they're not working. So mortality among the elderly isn't going to make much of a GDP impact. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have much of a welfare impact. So we just need to keep in mind that GDP and welfare are different objects. Okay, so what is there? There's a huge range of interesting policy opportunities for economists to be thinking about in a proactive way when we're thinking about climate policy. So there's a couple of different ways to think about this. A principled way to think about it is that there's actually quite a few externalities out there. So there's multiple externalities. So that means multiple policies are appropriate, multiple tools are appropriate. A more practical one is that if economists want to stay relevant in the debate, we have to be focused on meeting the political system and political discussion and other parts of the community where they actually are. So I think, if you talk to people who are not economists, you say, well, what do economists think about policy? The answer is, well, they just want to have a carbon tax. Well, of course, that is true. I think we all want to have a carbon tax. But I think it's also a matter of moving beyond a carbon tax as we think about policy design. And of course, one of the ways that this is not new is thinking about innovation policy. Our innovation policy has actually been an incredibly important part of climate policy, often not really called that. But if you think about the policies that have driven down the cost curve for photovoltaics between the Energiewende program in Germany and California Solar Initiative and other places that have forced the purchase or driven the purchase of very expensive photovoltaics, have actually really driven down costs in the photovoltaic industry and probably seem to have a big role in the current low cost of PV. So that's something that we've always paid attention to as economists, although perhaps not promoted as being as important as it needs to be. But there's an awful lot of other combination policies that are important to think about, or targeted policies. So I think the current world of policies is one in which one thinks about lots of externalities, some of them being narrow, not in a macroeconomic dimension, some of them being institutional constraints, some of them being other sorts of externalities. So think about network externalities associated with electric vehicles and charging stations, or a network or chicken and egg externality. And those are really important things to be working on as well. So there's a ton of other areas, supply side policies and industrial policies. The number of papers, so our major climate policy in the United States is a supply side industrial policy. Compare the number of papers on supply side industrial policy, green industrial policy, to carbon taxes in the literature. And I think that we'll find out the policies that we've adopted are not the policies that we've studied. So I think there's a lesson there for us. International coordination is really exciting, and this is a success story where I think economists have been thinking, Nordhaus has been thinking out of the box, and then people took that up, and now that actually is being taken up in Congress. I guess so what I think one of the things that has the most legs in Congress is to say that we should put on a border carbon adjustment because we're being active in climate policy because we're subsidizing green innovation. And if you think about that from the perspective of a traditional trade economist, subsidizing at home and then providing an import tariff somehow doesn't line up exactly with WTO principles, but if what you're trying to do is incentivize climate coordination, then perhaps it does line up. So it's a really interesting set of questions that challenges some of our basic principles of international trade. Absolutely needs to be thought about more and worked on more. There's some really interesting other things that we probably haven't thought about nearly enough, carbon dioxide removal at scale. So I'm super skeptical that in 2050, many of you are sure familiar with the overshoot concept, and then we overshoot CO2 concentrations, but then we reduce them using a variety of different technologies that are going to be having net emissions reduction. So we can call those technologies, broadly speaking, carbon dioxide removal, and they can be direct air capture or burning biomass, and then sequestering the carbon dioxide, other sorts of things like that. I'm super skeptical that we'll ever do that. I mean, for heaven's sakes, we can't even pass, in most countries, we can't even pass a $40 carbon tax. So if we can't pass a $40 carbon tax, why do we think that our children and grandchildren are going to fork it out to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? But, maybe we will. There's a lot to be studied there. This is a huge set of questions. Suppose we really were to be spending 2 to 3% of GDP on carbon dioxide removal. What does that actually mean for TFP? What does that mean for productive capital allocation? I think there's an awful lot of interesting questions to be paid attention to. I can't think of too many positives from this, but maybe there are. We need to have more thought on that. I'll tell you a really interesting area. Super interesting area is this notion of whether voluntary corporate targets and voluntary corporate behavior can really produce new ideas and real carbon emissions. So there's been some really fascinating work by a small number of accountants and economists thinking about whether or not voluntary corporate targets actually can produce overall economy-wide emissions reductions. There's an awful lot of reasons to be skeptical about that. I mean, I think as economists are trained to be skeptical about people standing up and voluntarily spending an awful lot of money to do something that is not necessarily in their best interest financially in a narrow sense. On the other hand, it is a thing. Is it something that we can really look at? So I've just listed a couple of interesting papers here. There's really not a very big literature, but if you look at the corporate behavior, GFANs, the other sort of entities that are focusing on making corporate disclosures, all the members of SERIs. This is really the World Economic Forum efforts. This is really a major thing in the private sector. Is it greenwashing? Is it really going to reduce emissions? And I guess my worry, why is it's interesting intellectually? My worry, and I don't know whether I'm right to worry about this or not, is that if we sort of say, hey, the corporate sector's got it, we don't really need to be doing any more. Well, is that right? Is that going to be enough? I mentioned degrowth. I could go on for degrowth for a long time, and I'm not going to. Okay, so let me raise a few things, a few more things. So the fourth major takeaway is that there's an awful lot we don't know about the implications of the energy transition. The energy transition, we are just beginning. What we need to be building out in wind and solar, of course, but also in the complete revamping of the technologies of the transportation sector, many aspects of production, the new inventions that are going to be figured out along the way, the vast, many trillions of dollars are going to be spent and redirected. And then, of course, all of the human social implications, declining petrostates, the political economy of changes or declines in the fossil fuel industry, changing geographic locations, migration, and all of the political pressures that is going to create. So I think it's really hard to get away from the fact that we over the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to see massive events. So there's a whole bunch of questions that rise from that general observation. I'm going to illustrate just a few of them, and I'm not going to have time to go through these in much detail. But they focus on looking at things, what are from the lens of, well, like, what do we really need to know in terms of macro impacts of all of these issues? So one set of macro impacts, and I think this is interesting, is looking at economic fluctuations implications from policy implementation. So a lot of the policy, so if you go back to the original idea of transition policy uncertainty, it's like, what are the macro effects of policy implications and policy changes? So there are two. I'm just going to give you two papers to think about, because I happen to be on one of the teams, and this is on our implications of implementation and changes in carbon taxes. So we have a paper in AEJ Macro that just came out that is looking at the effects of carbon tax changes in EU countries. And basically what we find is that if you look at GDP, so the idea is this is a panel VAR, panel local projections identification scheme, where we take advantage of the fact that the carbon tax has to be set in advance. So you need to know the tax rate over the course of the coming year. And since you know the tax rate over the course of the coming year, that gives you leverage in terms of identifying shocks and so forth. So we trace through shocks for changes in carbon tax rates. And we find basically no effect on employment, and we find basically no effect on GDP. We find an emissions effect. These are which is negative. It's not a very big one, but it's completely in line with what you'd expect from the magnitude of the price changes that are going to be implied by this in terms of just tracing through elasticities. Most of these EU carbon taxes cover the transportation sector, so that's pretty inelastic demand, and you wouldn't expect to see too many changes. Okay, so this is a really benign view of at least one efficient climate policy. This contrasts with a paper that I guess is now coming out in the ER by Diego Kanzig of Northwestern University, where what he finds is in a study of the EU ETS, which is a cap-and-trade system in the EU, that unanticipated changes in the EU ETS price actually have some substantial negative effects. So they're inflationary. They do reduce greenhouse emissions, GHG emissions, but the main channel is because they reduce industrial production, and they actually do have a negative effect. I don't show an employment effect, but they have a negative effect of employment. So they have an effect of a spillover into overall HICP inflation. So this is actually quite a different set of results. So you say, my gosh, this is crazy, because one of these is looking at a carbon tax and the other is looking at price changes in an EU ETS. And I thought we're supposed to think that cap and trade and carbon taxes are kind of the same thing, and carbon pricing and so forth. And one of these has these kind of pretty negative implications for macro stability and short-run macro fluctuations. And the other one is like it's a real shrug of the shoulders and it's great. And so at first, my reaction was that Diego's got to be getting it wrong and that he's sort of messed up in his econometrics, but he's quite good, and so I don't think that's the case. Actually, I think there really is something there. So there's really some very sort of interesting, subtle distinctions between these two in real world. This is important from a macro management, monetary policy, real-world fluctuations. And this is just one example. These are both pretty efficient policies. There's no such study of something like the IRA. There's some quick analysis that's done in a recent Brookings paper for the IRA, but there's much more work to be done. Much more work to be done. This is really important, thinking about climate policy. Another related thing is climate policy uncertainty. I'm not going to go through these slides because I don't want to take the time, but there's a small literature looking at climate policy uncertainty. Climate policy uncertainty, of course, you would expect through standard Real options approach to investment would be delaying investment, and indeed that actually might be related to the CONTIG result we just looked at, but it also is something that could be, reducing overall economic activity in line with the overall policy uncertainty literature. We take a look at this. There's a paper that I have some slides on here with. I'm going to just skip over all of this. That's with this paper with Diego Contig. That we're looking at climate policy uncertainty, and it seems to have negative effects on economic activity. Energy security and global energy markets of the future. This is something we don't really know very much about. So there's one view of this, I'll call it the benign view of transition of energy markets, is that many of the economic fluctuations that we've had over the last 50 years have been associated with oil price fluctuations. One view, the benign view, is, well, gosh, we're going to transition off of oil to things like wind and solar, and so there'll be a declining volatility in that area. I think that benign view might be right in 2150. I don't think that benign view is going to be right for the next, 30, 40, 50 years for our professional lifetime. I think that we're in a situation we're going to have continuing, in fact, I would guess, increasing amount of volatility in international fuels markets, because we're basically increasingly going to be integrating international fuels markets. I'm going to give you just one set of slides on this. This is looking at natural gas prices in the United States and the effects of LNG exporting on natural gas prices in the United States. So with the United States, if you look at the orange line, that is the export share of production. The United States is now exporting about 20% of its natural gas production. Over the next few years, that's probably going to go up to 40% of its natural gas production. We have a huge amount of natural gas that's available through fracking, and so we're going to be basically connecting that market to the rest of the world. I would argue it's already connected to the rest of the world. So we do a bunch of price analysis here, and you kind of have to squint at this a little bit. If you look at area 1A, clearly natural gas prices, which are in red, were connected to oil prices, which are in blue. They became disconnected during the fracking revolution. Recently, if you look at the far right, say since 2020, it looks like those prices are moving together. And indeed, if I carried it out further, those prices are moving together, but with a wedge. And that wedge is actually very well approximated by the cost of export of liquefaction, transportation, and regasification, which adds a big chunk to natural gas prices. So if you look at the domestic price and the world oil price, they're essentially reconnected in the United States, but with this transportation, gasification, liquefaction wedge. So that has big implications. I'm going to skip through all the econometrics. That has big implications in terms of thinking about what natural gas prices are going to be in the rest of the world, what natural gas prices are going to be in the U.S., and how that either does or does not expedite the energy transition. So that's something that is going to have implications for macroeconomists as we think about macro fluctuations, and especially implications for looking ahead, long-term energy markets. Many of the things that were being proposed for long-term energy markets, like e-fuels, bio-based SAFs, ammonia, green ammonia, are all liquid fuels or gaseous then liquefied. So these are all in the market competing for oil. So if they're all in the same market competing for oil with various subsidies, you'd expect that price fluctuations are going to be spilling over into the rest of the macroeconomy. I'm going to skip over this one. We know, but I think there's also long-term implications for macro policy parameters that we don't really have a good sense of as well. And that's an area where there's a lot of different work. Macroeconomics of adaptation. So this is a blank page, and it's not really completely a blank page. There's some really exciting, interesting work over the last few years on thinking about what adaptation policy should look like. But I think, but it's an open area that's going to be of increasing importance. And then deep uncertainty. So the final point I want to leave you with is the critical nature of deep uncertainty associated with all of the energy transition broadly defined. And this was this goes back to a lot of the great work that is being done at NGFS in terms of trying to think about what is the role of monetary policy in terms of getting ready for the sorts of shocks that could be occurring, that are occurring, but could be occurring in the future. Some of which we can anticipate, some of which are much harder to figure out. So one framework that I find useful is thinking about risk cascades. So how can climate change, maybe not physical climate change damages, they're not going to be big enough in almost all circumstances to actually be a big macro shock on their own. On the other hand, through various institutional challenges, maybe they can trigger risks that are going to be big enough that would be noticeable. So I'll give you an example of a risk cascade, which is the wildfires in California combined with inflation meant that there had to be a revaluation of prices for homeowners insurance. There's a cap on how much you can raise the homeowners insurance by, and so a number of companies decided to pull out of the market. So as homeowners insurance becomes less available in the market, that's going to have implications for the overall price of housing and for potential spillovers. Now, these spillovers didn't happen. This was too small to have any macro footprint, but it is something to bear in mind. And then finally, I'm just going to leave this, and I know that Tone is going to talk about this in his comments after this. But I would also stress that there really is lurking out there very major implications or very major challenges ahead. What are the things that we've missed? We have a history as a profession of doing well on the not very big things and really missing the super big things. And so what are the super big things that we're likely to be missing in this area? Thanks very much.